There's this idea that gets thrown around constantly, especially on the internet, that knowledge is power. You see it on Instagram posts with sunset backgrounds, hear it in graduation speeches, find it in self-help books written by people who made their money selling self-help books. And the thing is, it's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete, because knowledge sitting in your head doing nothing isn't power. Knowledge you can't apply, can't access when you need it, can't translate into action, that's just trivia. The real power comes from what you do with what you know. But let's start with why we even care about this. Why does knowledge matter at all? Because for most of human history, it didn't matter that much for most people. You were born into a role, a class, a trade, and that's what you did. Your father was a blacksmith, you became a blacksmith. Your family worked the land, you worked the land. Knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a few, priests and nobles and scholars, and they used that concentration to maintain control. If you couldn't read, you couldn't access religious texts, couldn't understand laws, couldn't challenge the people who claimed authority over you. Ignorance kept people in their place. That started to change with the printing press. Suddenly, books could be mass-produced, information could spread. It wasn't immediate, the transition took centuries, but slowly the gatekeepers lost their monopoly. More people learned to read, ideas traveled faster, and knowledge became something that wasn't just for the elite. The Enlightenment happened, revolutions happened, science accelerated. And at the core of all of it was the democratization of information. People who'd been kept in the dark started to see, and once they saw, they couldn't be controlled the same way anymore. Fast forward to now, and we're living in the most information-rich period in human history. You can access more knowledge in 10 minutes on your phone than someone in the 1800s could access in a lifetime. Want to learn quantum physics? Free lectures online. Want to understand economics? Thousands of articles, videos, courses available right now. Want to know how to fix your car or cook a meal or speak a new language? It's all there, mostly free, waiting for you to engage with it. But here's the paradox. We have access to infinite information, and yet we're not necessarily smarter or wiser or better equipped to handle the world. In fact, in some ways we're more confused than ever. Because having access to knowledge isn't the same as having knowledge. And having knowledge isn't the same as understanding it. And understanding isn't the same as being able to use it effectively. Think about how much information you consume in a day. Articles, videos, social media posts, podcasts, conversations, emails, news alerts. You're constantly taking in data, constantly being told things, constantly exposed to ideas and facts and opinions. But how much of it actually sticks? How much of it changes how you think or behave? How much of it could you even recall a week later? For most of us, the honest answer is not much. We're drowning in information but starving for wisdom. Part of the problem is that we've confused information with knowledge. Information is data, raw facts, things you can look up. The capital of France is Paris, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, the speed of light is about 300,000 kilometers per second. That's information. Knowledge is what happens when you organize that information, understand the relationships between pieces of it, see patterns and principles. It's the difference between knowing facts and understanding how things work. But even knowledge isn't enough on its own. You can understand how something works without being able to apply that understanding. Plenty of people know that exercise and good diet lead to better health, but they still don't exercise or eat well. Plenty of people understand compound interest, but they don't save or invest. Knowledge that doesn't translate into action is just intellectual decoration. It makes you sound smart at parties, but doesn't actually change your life. So what does real power look like? It's knowledge that you can access when you need it, apply to solve problems, use to make better decisions. It's understanding that shapes your behavior, informs your choices, helps you navigate complexity. And that's much harder to achieve than just consuming information. It requires effort, practice, reflection. It requires actually thinking about what you're learning instead of just passively absorbing it. Here's an example. You can read 100 articles about time management, learn all the theories and techniques and systems. That's information becoming knowledge. But until you actually implement one of those systems, adjust it to fit your life, stick with it long enough to see results, you haven't gained any real power from it. The knowledge is useless until it changes what you do. And changing what you do is the hard part, the part where most people fail. This is why education is so often ineffective, not because what's being taught is wrong, but because it's taught in a way that prioritizes information transfer over actual understanding and application. Students memorize facts for tests, regurgitate them, and then forget them immediately because they never had to actually use that knowledge for anything real. They learned about photosynthesis, but never thought about what it means for the food they eat. They learned about historical events, but never connected them to current political situations. The information went in and out without ever becoming functional knowledge. The best learning, the kind that actually gives you power, is learning that's connected to doing. You learn something and then you apply it immediately. You get feedback, you adjust, you try again. This is how people learn skills, how apprenticeships worked for centuries, how you actually get good at anything. You don't just study carpentry, you build things and make mistakes and figure out what works. You don't just read about cooking, you cook meals and burn things and eventually develop intuition for flavors and techniques. But we've moved away from that model in a lot of areas. We've made learning abstract, disconnected from reality. And then we wonder why people graduate with degrees but can't function in their fields, why they have credentials but no competence. The knowledge never became real for them because it was never tested against actual challenges. There's another dimension to this too. Not just applying knowledge, but knowing what knowledge you need. This is information literacy, the ability to figure out what you don't know and how to find it. In the past, when information was scarce, the challenge was access. Now that information is abundant, the challenge is curation. You need to know what's worth learning, what sources are reliable, what's signal and what's noise. This is a skill that almost nobody teaches explicitly, but it might be the most important skill in the modern world. The ability to quickly assess whether a source is credible, whether a claim is backed by evidence, whether an argument is sound. The ability to distinguish between expertise and confidence, between data and interpretation. The ability to say, I don't know enough about this, let me research before forming an opinion. These metacognitive skills, thinking about thinking, are what separate people who get smarter from people who just accumulate more confused beliefs. And it's hard because we're wired to seek certainty, to prefer simple answers, to believe things that confirm what we already think. Our brains are not naturally skeptical or rigorous. They're pattern-matching machines that jump to conclusions based on limited data, because throughout most of human history, that was adaptive. Better to assume the rustling in the bushes is a predator and be wrong than to assume it's nothing and get eaten. But in the modern information environment, those instincts lead us astray constantly. We believe things because they feel right, because they align with our tribe's beliefs, because someone confident said them, because they're emotionally satisfying. And then we seek out information that confirms what we already believe and dismiss information that challenges it. This is confirmation bias, and everyone does it to some degree. Fighting it requires conscious effort, requires training yourself to actively seek out opposing viewpoints, to engage with the best arguments against your position, to update your beliefs when the evidence changes. That's what real intellectual power looks like. Not having all the answers, but having the tools to find answers, the humility to admit uncertainty, the flexibility to change your mind. It's being comfortable saying, I was wrong about that, or I need to learn more before I decide. Those are signs of strength, not weakness, even though our culture often treats them as the opposite. Knowledge also gives you power in relationships and social situations. Understanding psychology, understanding how people think and what motivates them, that's leverage. Not in a manipulative sense necessarily, though it can be used that way, but in the sense that you can communicate more effectively, resolve conflicts better, build stronger connections. You can recognize when someone's acting out of fear versus malice, when they're projecting their insecurities versus making a valid criticism. That kind of social-emotional knowledge is underrated but incredibly valuable. The same goes for understanding systems, how organizations work, how economies function. Knowledge as power means that those who control knowledge or control access to it have power over others. This is why authoritarian governments restrict information, why propaganda works, why wealthy elites have always ensured their children get better education than everyone else's. If knowledge is democratized, power is democratized. If you can keep people ignorant or confused or overwhelmed with contradictory information, you can control them more easily. We're seeing this play out in real time with the internet. On one hand, we have unprecedented access to information. On the other hand, we have unprecedented amounts of misinformation, disinformation, and information overload. It's never been easier to learn anything you want, and it's never been easier to be misled or confused. The people who benefit from public ignorance have adapted. They don't stop information from spreading anymore, they flood the zone with so much information, much of it false or misleading, that people can't tell what's true. They create doubt about expertise itself, make people skeptical of legitimate knowledge while promoting conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. Fighting this requires not just seeking knowledge, but developing critical thinking skills, understanding epistemology, knowing how we know what we know. Why do we believe scientific consensus? Not because scientists are never wrong, they are, but because the scientific method is a process designed to reduce bias and error over time, to test ideas against reality. Why do we trust certain sources over others? Because they have track records of accuracy, transparent methodologies, accountability when they make mistakes. But you have to learn these frameworks. Nobody's born understanding them. And if you don't, you're vulnerable to believing anything that sounds good or confirms your biases. You become easy to manipulate, easy to mislead. Your lack of knowledge gives others power over you. This is why education matters so much, and why underfunding education is such a tragedy. Not just the economic opportunity cost, though that's real, but the democratic cost. An uneducated population can't effectively govern itself, can't evaluate policy proposals, can't hold leaders accountable. They're at the mercy of whoever can tell the most compelling story, whoever can appeal to their emotions most effectively. Knowledge, real knowledge, is what allows people to cut through the bullshit, to ask hard questions, to demand evidence. But again, just having information available isn't enough. You need curiosity, motivation, discipline. You need to care about understanding things, to be willing to put in the work of learning. And that's cultural as much as individual. Some cultures celebrate learning and intellectual achievement. Others are anti-intellectual, treat education as elitism or book knowledge as less valuable than common sense. Both extremes are problems. You need respect for expertise without blind deference to authority. You need practical wisdom alongside theoretical understanding. The other thing about knowledge as power is that it compounds. The more you know, the easier it becomes to learn more, because new information connects to existing frameworks. If you understand basic economics, learning about specific economic policies is easier. If you understand history, current events make more sense. If you understand psychology, philosophy becomes more accessible. Knowledge builds on itself in ways that create increasing returns. This is partly why inequality tends to perpetuate itself. People with education and resources can acquire knowledge more easily, use it more effectively, pass it on to their children. People without those advantages start behind and often stay behind, not because they're less capable, but because they're fighting uphill. Breaking that cycle requires deliberate effort, requires making knowledge genuinely accessible, not just theoretically available. And accessible means more than just free. It means presented in ways people can understand, relevant to their lives, connected to their goals. It means meeting people where they are instead of expecting them to already have context and vocabulary they were never taught. It means acknowledging that someone can be brilliant and capable while not knowing things that seem basic to people who had different opportunities. There's also the question of what knowledge is worth pursuing. You can't learn everything, time and attention are limited, so you have to choose what's worth knowing. Some knowledge is instrumental, it helps you achieve specific goals. Some is intrinsically valuable, it makes life richer even if it's not useful in a practical sense. Some is foundational, it helps you understand everything else. The best education includes all three types. But in a world that increasingly values only instrumental knowledge, only things that lead directly to employment or profit, we're losing something important. Understanding art and literature and philosophy might not make you money, but it makes you more thoughtful, more empathetic, better able to grapple with complex moral and existential questions. Scientific literacy might not be relevant to your job, but it helps you make sense of medical decisions, environmental issues, technological changes. Historical knowledge might seem impractical, but it gives you perspective on the present, helps you recognize patterns, understand why things are the way they are. The most powerful people, the ones who shape the world, tend to have broad knowledge across multiple domains. They can connect ideas from different fields, see analogies and patterns that specialists miss. They understand technology and business and psychology and culture. That range gives them advantages that pure expertise in one area doesn't provide. But building that range requires curiosity and time and a willingness to learn things that aren't immediately useful. It also requires being okay with being a beginner, with not being good at something right away. This is hard for people, especially adults who are used to being competent in their domains. Learning genuinely new things means struggling, making mistakes, feeling dumb. But that's where growth happens, in that discomfort. Knowledge that comes easy isn't usually knowledge that transforms you. So what does all this mean practically? How do you actually use knowledge as power in your life? You start by getting clear on what you want to achieve, what problems you're trying to solve, what skills would make the biggest difference for you. Then you pursue that knowledge deliberately, not passively. You read, you take courses, you find mentors, you practice. You apply what you learn as quickly as possible so it becomes real, so you get feedback and can adjust. You also build systems for retaining and organizing what you learn. Take notes, create summaries, teach concepts to others. This forces you to process information deeply instead of just consuming it. You revisit material periodically, especially the foundational stuff, because memory fades. You connect new knowledge to old knowledge, build frameworks and mental models that let you store information efficiently. And you stay humble about what you know. Expertise in one area doesn't make you an expert in others. Being smart doesn't mean you're right about everything. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know, how complex most issues are, how many factors you're not considering. That awareness is valuable. It keeps you from overconfidence, keeps you learning. Knowledge is power, but only when it's active, applied, integrated into how you think and act. It's not something you possess like an object. It's something you embody, something that shapes who you are and what you can do. The person with a library card and curiosity has more real power than the person with a degree and no interest in learning anything new. Because power isn't about credentials or titles or how much you knew once upon a time. It's about what you can do right now, what problems you can solve, what value you can create. And in a world that's changing fast,